Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yariv Lapid. I'm the director of the Levine Institute for Holocaust Education here at the museum. I'd go straight to introducing our next speakers in this upcoming panel. We'll start with Dr. Bettina Brandt, who currently works as a teaching professor in the Department of German Literature, Department of German and Russian Languages and Literatures at the Pennsylvania State University. She holds a PhD in Comparative Literature, French, German, and American from Harvard University. Brandt, who is also a translator, is the recipient of several research awards and fellowships. In 2017, she received the Botziber Fellowships for Austrian American Studies to conduct research in Vienna, and a Martin Miller, Hannah Norbert Miller Visiting Fellowship at the University of London to conduct research in British archives. In the fall of 2016, she was a fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies in the Netherlands. She is currently working on a monograph that is a collective biography about 4 generations of an extended Austrian Jewish family with a focus on the Holocaust years and the care for the elderly left behind in Vienna after the Angelus. Bettina, please come over.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Can you all hear me? Okay. I will not be talking about the research project you just heard, but about something else. Related to today's topic. My title is Difficult to Cheer Up These Downhearted People, American Quakers Helping Jews Flee Nazi Vienna. What can be said about Jewish life and forced emigration from Vienna following the annexation of Austria, here defined as the daily lives of all those who were racially persecuted under the Nuremberg laws, largely depends on the archival sources to which researchers have access, since these archives are the prisms through which we see what we are studying. Our understanding of daily Jewish life in Vienna between 1938 to 1945 increased dramatically after the archives of the Viennese Jewish community, or Israelitische Kultusgemeinde IKG, were rediscovered in 2000 and brought in 3 parts to the United States Holocaust Museum with the help of Anatol Steck. With the help of these archives, writers and scholars such as Doron Rabinovich, and following very closely in his footsteps, Ilana Offenberger, who spoke to us earlier today, were able to draw a broad picture of the immigration and later deportation-related work that the Jewish community in Vienna performed under duress in the 7 years following the Anschluss. While the IKG archives provide basic biographical information regarding all Viennese Jews, since they contain birth, marriage, and death records of the members of this religious community dating back to the 1850s, and also shed light on the immigration plans of destitute religious Jews who filled out immigration questionnaires at the IKG and received financial and practical aid from this community, they offer no insight into the immigration plans of those whose parents and grandparents were of the Jewish faith, but who themselves were either no longer religious or had gone even one step further and converted to Protestantism, or more frequently in Austria, to Catholicism. By looking at multi-generational Jewish responses to the Anschluss and thus focusing on larger family units, who were seldom homogeneous, it becomes clear that families often had to knock on many different doors when they needed financial or administrative help in getting all their family members out of Nazi Vienna. While religious Jews, robbed of their financial means, could turn to the IKG in the Seitenstättengasse, the Jewish community did not offer immigration help, be it financial or administrative, to those Jews who had resigned from the faith in this or in earlier generations, since the financial resources of the IKG were limited. For Viennese Jews who were racially persecuted but who did not self-identify as Jewish, there were a number of religious and humanitarian organizations in Vienna that could be approached for help in getting out of Nazi Europe. Converted Protestants could turn to the so-called Swedish Mission. Converted Catholics could, in principle, turn to the Archbishop's Aid Service, though it didn't really take off until 1940, when chances of emigrating were close to nil. And those who did not fit in anywhere and were let down by the other organizations came to the Zingerstraße 16, right behind St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna's inner city, where the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers, had rented offices since the late 19-teens, and which after the Angelus became less a center of the Society of Friends in Austria and more an outpost for British and American welfare workers. All religious and humanitarian organizations had to work with Eichmann's Immigration Bureau, and all organizations worked with each other, though each focused on one specific part of the immigration market. Today, I'm focusing on the immigration aid that the American Quakers, who worked at the Viennese Center of the Society of Friends, provided to Austrian Jews fleeing the Nazis. What new insights can be gained about forced Jewish immigration from Vienna by examining the refugee case files of the American Friends Service Committee, or AFSC? AFSC refugee case files challenge traditional narratives of Jewish immigration from Vienna by offering a different perspective from the margins of Jewish experiences, and as such, underline the plurality of Jewish transnational immigration from Vienna after the Anschluss. In contrast to the immigration questionnaires of the IKG that offer us basic biographical and professional facts about potential immigrants and sometimes give a sense of where families and individuals hope to resettle after leaving Vienna, the AFSC refugee case files, which are often several dozen pages long, offer a longer durée perspective on the personal and professional trajectories that refugees had to travel while emigrating from Vienna to the United States. Through these files, which contain letters written by the staff of various Quaker centers in Europe, as well as letters from the AFSC officers in the United States, letters from other organizations to which the AFSC turned for help in individual cases, letters, CVs, and photos from the applicants who were turned to these centers, we can trace the trajectory of a potential refugee from their initial interview in the months and years leading up to their forced departure, to their initial arrival in the United States, and their eventual resettlement in a new city, and sometimes in a new profession. Today, I'll be talking about one particular AFSC refugee case file, about a young man named Rudolf Schreck, who was 28 years old when he fled from Vienna to the United States. Since he had 3 Jewish grandparents, the Nazi Nuremberg laws classified Rudolf as a Jew. His Jewish mother, Dora, had married Franz Schreck, a Catholic, and after Franz died in 1917, Dora raised their only child together with her older sister, Clementine. Before escaping from Vienna in the late fall of 1939, with the help of the Quakers in Vienna, Rudy worked for a large company that produced fezzes, felt hats, in the form of a truncated cone ornamented with a black tassel. I'll show you a few pictures in a moment. Until his immigration to the United States in the fall of 1939, Rudy lived with his mother and his aunt, whom he considered to be his parents, at the Währinger Straße in Vienna's 9th district. Rudolf's AFSC refugee case file number 2112 contains what I call 4 file stories, 2 of which I'll be briefly presenting here today. The AFSC refugee case files are there are 22,000 of them. They are here at the Holocaust Museum, and they have been made available and brought to the limelight very much thanks to Ron Coleman, who's probably somewhere here as well today. All right, so I'm going to tell you 2 file stories out of 4. The first file story, which brings to the fore the implicit criteria that the Refugee Division followed in selecting their applicants, is the narrative about Rudy's emigration to the United States and his personal and professional struggle in his first couple of years as a refugee in the Midwest. This story is an AFSC success story about emigration and assimilation. The file records the help that Rudy received from various AFSC employees on his long path from Vienna, where he had registered with the American consulate in July of 1938, via Trieste, where he boarded a ship, Algiers, where he was taken off the boat by the French, New York City, where he landed, Philadelphia, where he traveled next, and to 3 small towns in Iowa. West Branch, where the AFSC between 1939 and 1943 ran a hostel for European refugees called Scattergood, Marshalltown, Iowa, where Rudy lands his first job, and Corning, Iowa, where Rudy finds his second job as a porter clerk at a hotel. At the same time, this file story shows us how the small local communities to which German refugees were increasingly sent in order to keep the refugee population away from the East and the West Coast. We will see how, in this file, how these local communities in the Midwest reacted to the presence of their new German Jewish immigrant neighbors or employees. This file story clearly illustrates the presence of anti-Semitism in the United States in the 1940s and the popular fear of the presence of a 5th column, i.e. the concern that a good number of German refugees in the United States were working as spies for the Nazis. And if you've been here all day, you've heard about all these aspects before. Finally, this upbeat file story shows how the AFSC Refugee Division, particularly the placement officers at the Scattergood Hostel in West Branch, Iowa, emotionally supported Rudy, and how individual clergymen in Marshalltown, Iowa, were willing to do so as well. Let us now briefly look at a few slides so that you see what I've been telling you so far, and we can read some quotes that I culled from Rudy's letters to his placement officer at Scattergood. We'll look at 10 slides, then I'll tell you my second file story. I hope this is going to work. All right, so that's just the title. Here we see Fez's. I told you he worked for a large Fez production company. He, in fact, was a bookkeeper for this company. Anyway, examples of Fez's. After Ataturk decided that no more Fez's should be produced in Turkey, Vienna became the capital of Fez production. Here we see a number of the aid organizations that helped those who could not turn, those who needed to get out of Vienna and were in need of help and administrative support. We've heard a lot about the IKG, who did, of course, wonderful work, the Society of Friends that I'm talking about, the Swedish Mission I've mentioned. Then there's also the Gildemeesteraktion. I'm not going to go into that. It's a different topic. And again, here we see a quote from the American Friends Service annual report from 1938. You can see the center in the Zingerstrasse. They conducted 500 interviews a week in the late summer of 1938. They were created only after Kristallnacht, so this is one of the first Christian responses. We see here a picture of Scattergood, this place in West Branch, Iowa. You see here's I don't know if this has a pointer, I guess not. Anyway, you see Rudolf Schreck, he's quoted as an advertisement for the place. There he is also in the right slide. He's repairing a roof, the bald man on the right slide. Then one of his first jobs is to be a Fuller Brushman. And here's Rudy on the right, and this is the American idea of the Fuller Brushman. So what happens to Rudy when he goes door to door and when he's trying to sell these brushes? Somebody said, and you can read that the other Fuller Brushman in town, that's me, is said to be a German spy. When I heard that, I was speechless. I had noticed that some people asked me quite strange questions, and I wondered about it. Then he says it's very hard to work like this, and at the bottom, what I underlined for you, I'm going around here now as if I would still be in Vienna, always with the feeling that the other person to which I'm speaking thinks me to be her enemy. Since Rudy was a Catholic, he also contacted the Committee for Catholic Refugees from Germany. They did not consider him to be an urgent case, but the one person involved was Reverend Ostermann, and you see him here on the right. He writes a letter to the AFSC saying, instantly, we hope he's not going around from house to house selling Fuller's brushes, because then that hasn't been a good placement if he does that. Okay, his next job is at the Hotel Bacon in Corning, Iowa. Here is a picture of that. And again, a quote from the letter. This hotel is run by a Mr. W. He has a last name, but I'm just telling you his name is W. Mr. W won't even bring me my mail anymore. I write too many letters. I get too many letters. I get too many German letters from my mother only. My handkerchiefs are too many and too dirty, and so on, etc., ad infinitum. I guess this is a so-called free country, and what I wish to do in my free time, if I write 100 letters, Mr. W and his wife have not the right to forbid me that, which means to forbid my correspondence with my mother, so as to make me unable to be of help for anybody else. Attention, W don't like having Jewish-looking people here. It sounds funny. It's a fact. All right, the second file story is one of administrative and human failure. It shows us that when Rudy is not working as a Fuller Brushman or as a night porter, or later working for a company in Buffalo that produces Basque berets, an obvious job for Rudy to get given his early experience in the fez-making business in Vienna. He's working hard on reuniting his family in the United States by getting his mother Dora and his aunt Clementina out of Vienna. This file story offers us a glimpse of what the immigration policy of the United States looked like on the ground, and what the impact of this strict policy was on the 65,000 elderly Jews still stuck in Austria after the outbreak of World War II. It documents how American consuls in Vienna denied two elderly sisters, Dora and Clementine, a visa without giving any reason. They also registered in July of 1938, same day as Rudy. It also shows how individual employees of the AFSC go to bat for individual applicants and their families with whom they've established a personal relationship over the years, and with whom they try to help with the family reunification. The AFSC prompts the consular offices in Vienna to reconsider Dora's case. The AFSC also writes uplifting letters to both Rudolf and Dora, and finally shows, and here I'm quoting my title, not only how difficult it was to cheer up these downhearted people, but how, at a certain moment in time, that was often the only thing that the AFSC could do for Jews in Vienna who were, in the words of Marion Kaplan, stuck between dignity and despair. We're going to look briefly at 5 more slides, and then I'm done. Rudy, Dora, Springer. Here, it's a description from the AFSC report of 1940, showing some of the workers who are important for this case. Margaret E. Jones is one of the American Friends who was the director from February to September 1940. It also shows how there isn't much happening on the visa front. So the AFSC was also helpful in providing news to those refugees who had fled Vienna and were now cut off from news from their relatives, since these relatives could only write in code and not say very much what was going on, whereas these Quaker workers had been in Vienna longer and could more freely speak about this situation. You can read it for yourself. At the bottom you see, Iowa's wonderful, and I love everything here, including the people, but there's still a long way to enjoy all that, as long as one has one's thoughts and one's heart not yet quite in this country. Would you enjoy life if you have to realize all the time that your relatives and most of your friends have to live in conditions which are not at all to be called human? And beside that, we enjoy freedom and millions don't. That is enough to make a man mad. Here we have the visa rejection letter from the American consulate. In the meantime, Dora Schreck has been forced to move several times. She's living now on the Berggasse, several blocks away from Sigmund Freud with her older sister. As you can see, it said no reason. We denied a visa application. Here we have Margaret Jones, who we already mentioned before. She's writing to Ephra Warren, who's then chief of the visa section of the State Department, saying, please reconsider this. Everything has been done. There are affidavits. The son has a job. There are people who want to provide housing in the United States. The ship tickets are here. The answer is a form letter. We will look into and tell you what's happening. Again, Margaret Jones saying that no more visas are given and that it's unconscious. No, not unconscious. Thank you. to keep telling people that they can get out, and that they do all this work, that they psych themselves up for all of this if nothing's happening. You can read for yourself. And then finally, here is the quote on your left. We are in touch with Rudolf, of course. One finds it very difficult to try to cheer up these downhearted people, but Rudolf and his mother must continue to believe that they will see each other once again. Rudolf never saw his mother again. Dora Schreck was murdered in Mali Trostinets. We've been talking about that today already a number of times. Dora was the youngest of 8 siblings. Most of her siblings didn't survive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bettina. Our next speaker is Melissa Jane Taylor. Melissa joined the Office of the Historian at the US Department of State in 2006 after completing her PhD in modern history, modern European history, at the University of Southern Carolina. In her work at the office, Taylor provides historical policy support for her colleagues working in Europe, teaches at the Foreign Service Institute, and has undertaken a joint project with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum to create case studies that highlight bureaucratic decision-making in moments of crisis, an important part of our work at the Levine Institute. Taylor's personal research outside of the office focuses primarily on American consular officers serving in Europe prior to World War II. She has published widely in academic journals, including Holocaust and Genocide Studies and Diplomatic History. Melissa will speak to us on the immigration experience of elderly Austrian Jews.
Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Dokumentationsarchiv des Österreichischen Widerstandes, and the Embassy of Austria for the invitation to present my research to you today. As a federal employee, I need to provide you with the requisite disclaimer before I begin to talk about my research. The views expressed here are entirely my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Office of the Historian, the U.S. Department of State, or the U.S. government. If you type "history of elderly Austrian Jews" into Google, the first hit you receive is for the history of the Austrian Jewish community on the Claims Conference for Material Claims Against Germany page. The word elderly appears only once, and it is 2/3 of the way down on that page in a section on the post-war community. Quote, naturally it was mostly only the elderly, those who had a more difficult time settling abroad, who returned, end quote. My research examines elderly Austrian Jews' quote-unquote difficult time settling abroad by exploring the interaction of American consular officials and elderly visa applicants, as well as what made immigrating from Austria so difficult for the elderly. Until recently, few immigration historians have studied the impact of age on the immigration experience. While historians of the Holocaust have examined that impact, the impact of that experience with regard to age, the focus, again, until recently, has been primarily on the experience of children during the Holocaust, not the elderly. My research draws on archival letter collections and published memoirs in order to better understand how elderly Jewish immigrants navigated their immigration experience. While emigration and immigration created complex challenges for all, the challenges were greater if you were elderly. When I talk about the elderly today, I mean anyone over the age of 45. And what we have to realize, as everyone laughs, is that both life expectancy at that time and the age ranges that were tabulated when individuals immigrated into this country were based on age brackets, and 45 years and older was the oldest age bracket. So that's why I chose 45. In today's presentation, I would like to summarize my findings. First, the additional factors for elderly individuals regarding their decision to immigrate. And second, what was the elderly's interaction with American consular officials when they applied for their visas? If we start with the additional factors in elderly immigrants' decision-making process, it is important to account for how much more difficult immigration is as you age. In many ways, an elderly person is quote-unquote set in their outlook, their worldview, their culture, their language, and their routines. To reset all of that when you are older takes more effort and determination, and as a result, losses and gains were more carefully weighed in the decision-making process as to whether to immigrate. From a psychological standpoint, for the elderly, the past was often greater than was the future, and their location, whether that was a home, a community, or a country, provided a sense of security. Gerontologists who have studied elderly immigration argue that full acculturation can only be achieved by those that are relatively young, and that thereafter full acculturation into a new country is less achievable. What this means is that immigrants past that age will not age with an American cultural outlook, but with one from their cultural home. And this can create challenges in making and retaining communities and relationships, but also in terms of accessing services and care, which can in fact diminish one's quality of life. For some Austrian Jews, the pension for which they had worked their entire lives delayed or prevented their immigration. Marjorie Mentz-Perloff, Richard Schule's granddaughter, described the events leading up to her grandfather's immigration from Vienna in her memoir. Quote, "I find grandfather's actions between March and July 1938 somewhat troubling. He might easily have been imprisoned, interred, or killed by the Gestapo, as were many of his friends. He let his wife and family leave without him because he was determined to get his pension, which he never got, although many years later there were some reparations. He thought that his old friends and colleagues would remain loyal to him. Of course, they did not," end quote. Schule was not alone in his belief that a lifetime of friends and Austrian cultural norms would not abandon him after the annexation in March 1938. But that is what happened to so many. Schule was fortunate that he was still able to leave and join the rest of his family who had already immigrated. When elderly Austrian Jews decided to pursue immigration, it is important to understand how their situation was viewed by American consular officials who granted the all-important visa. Family reunification had a major impact on how consular officials perceived of the situation. Acquiring a sufficient affidavit of support became increasingly more difficult with every individual added to a visa application, which meant that many families had to split into smaller units or immigrate individually before being reunited in the United States. For elderly immigration applicants, however, having the familial support was viewed far more favorably by consular officers than not. Families who immigrated as a complete unit, or elderly parents who immigrated to join their adult children already in the United States, had greater success than those elderly individuals who were childless and without immediate familial support. Leo Spitzer, who documented his family's immigration experience in his book Hotel Bolivia, describes the immigration of his parents and his grandparents from Vienna to Bolivia in 1939, where other extended family awaited them. In 1950, Spitzer's family immigrated to the United States. In his memoir, Spitzer notes how the experience differed among the generations. Spitzer was fluent in Spanish, and after 10 years in Bolivia, his grandmother hardly spoke the language at all. Spitzer also described how the Landmannschaft, or Austrian club, established in 1941, provided cultural continuity for many of the adults who found refuge in Bolivia. Emil and Greta Zinger, on the other hand, failed to immigrate, despite both applying for U.S. immigration visas. The Zingers were in their late 50s when they applied, and they were childless, although they did have the necessary documentation. Zinger, in fact, supported himself by creating etchings, beautiful etchings of scenes in Vienna. While immigration to the United States was never based on whether the applicant had children or not, it is clear that the support of a family could contribute in multiple and significant ways when it came to immigration. The perceived or promised support that adult children could offer to their aging parents was critical from the consular point of view, in that it made elderly applicants less likely to need government support, which would have disqualified them for a visa. Greta Katz, like Emil Zinger, also registered for immigration to the United States. Her son, daughter, and son-in-law had preceded her in their immigration, but her attempts to join them failed. It is clear from the significant trove of correspondence between the three Katzes, the mother, daughter, and the son, that the end goal was family reunification in whichever location the first family was able to immigrate to. Katz's letters indicate a changing generational role that transpired for the family during the immigration process. Lena, Katz's daughter, began mothering and caring for her mother at her age of 27. Katz still expressed motherly concern in her letters. She worried about her children, their health, and their lives very far away from her. Lena, however, through her correspondence, coaxed her mother to become more involved in preparing for her immigration. In mid-1941, Lena wrote this to her mother, quote, "I infer from your last letter that you were afraid. I do not know why. 80-year-old people travel alone to the United States. It comes from the small European circumstances. Here in the United States, a trip of 5 to 6 hours is nothing, whereas I remember when we were going to Ischl in the Salzkammergut region of Austria, you preferred to be at the train station at least 3 hours prior to the departure of the train. We have the intention of bringing you to us, and you also want to come, so put your nervousness aside," end quote. In this small extraction, we can see the changing roles in the mother-daughter relationship, the upheaval of cultural norms, and Greta's reluctance and anxiety about all of it. Ultimately, despite all of Lena's efforts and hard work, Greta was unable to immigrate. The United States consulate closed permanently before her quota number for a visa was reached. Like so many other elderly Austrian Jews, Greta experienced the overaging of Vienna as young people fled and the elderly were left behind. The Israelitisches Kultusgemeinde Wien, or Viennese Jewish community, which we've already heard much about today, provided services and carefully documented the changing situation for the time in which these individuals remained in Vienna. The case studies used in this research, some of which I've presented briefly today, indicate that exploring immigration through the lens of family, especially when dealing with the immigration of the elderly, is useful. While immigration of multiple individuals is inherently more complex than the immigration of just one, it appears that elderly immigrants stood to gain in the 1930s and 40s through the immigration of an entire family, or family reunification. The elderly immigrant certainly would have appreciated the support and security presumably provided by family members. But in the eyes of consular officials and the state, it appears that the familial support was an asset and put the individual at less risk of needing government support. It appears that American Foreign Service officers seemed more amenable to the immigration of the elderly when a family support system was already in place. Immigration of the elderly poses different problems and concerns than for immigrants in younger age brackets. While many of the more specialized historical immigration studies have focused on issues of gender, ethnicity, and class, the elderly have not attracted much scholarly attention. And yet, this is an important part of Holocaust history, Austrian history, and US history. We have much to gain by better understanding what happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Our next speaker is Frances Tanzer. Frances is a visiting assistant professor at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She received her PhD in history at Brown University in 2018. Her research focuses on minorities, art, and nationalism in Central Europe. A current project, Vanishing Vienna, explores representations of Jewish absence in post-Nazi Vienna and Austria. More broadly, her research interests include Central European Jewish history, migration, and the construction of national and European cultural identities. She has received awards from the Botziber Institute for Austrian American Studies, the Central European History Society, the Goethe Research Institute, German Historical Institute, Holocaust Education Foundation at Northwestern University, and she will speak to us today about the Viennese Jewish cabaret artists in exile in the United States.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I thought it would be fitting to start my presentation today, which is about the Viennese cabaret, with a joke. Although I have to admit that the joke isn't particularly funny. 3 passengers are huddled in the corner of a steamer on their way to Ellis Island fleeing Nazi Europe, and they are all talking about the fate of Europe. The first passenger is optimistic. He declares that Europe would be won back soon through a submarine battle. The second passenger disagrees. For him, Europe, the place, was lost forever and could not be won back through a simple battle that sought to regain control of the physical territory. This passenger proposes, and I'm quoting, that it is clear that Europe is from now on a condition and will no longer be a continent. Reluctantly, and with much prodding from the others, the third passenger finally agrees to deliver his take on the fate of Europe. And so he nods in thanks, sighs deeply, and leans over the side of the boat, tossing the contents of his stomach into the rolling sea. I told you it wasn't funny. The author of this joke was the Viennese cabaret artist and humorist Karl Farkas. He wrote the joke just after he fled from Vienna to the United States via the so-called Spanish route, which took him over the Pyrenees through Spain and out of Europe through Lisbon, which we've heard so much about today. His description of his own departure from Europe makes it clear that the creative pessimism and sheer revulsion of the second and third passengers resembled his own response to his forced emigration. In a poem that he wrote just at the time of his departure, Farkas condemned the Europe that had once praised him, but now spat him into the sea. At the same time, when he sat in a Lisbon cafe in 1939, surrounded by German-speaking patrons from Vienna and Prague, who spoke of nothing but their imminent departure, he felt, and this is a quote from him, the opposite of homesickness, for he noted that Europe would be traveling with him. In his approximation, the Nazi destruction of the Central European world that had included Jews as constituent members of society and culture created the necessity for the reinvention of the continent, of the city of Vienna, and also of himself. And that intimate story of reinvention, which spread so far beyond this individual, is what I would like to talk about today. The paper that follows explores the ways that cabaret artists reimagined the relationship between Viennese, European, and Jewish identity through their popular performances in exile. Indeed, it chronicles the way that such performers tethered their representations of Vienna to the Jewish experience of exile. And in this way, they crafted identities as émigrés, while also documenting the challenges of their process of assimilation in the American context. Now, a goal of this talk, and the broader work of which it is a part, is to suggest that we think about refugees, in this case Jewish refugees, as an important part of European history. And to that end, this talk makes three interconnected arguments. First, Viennese Jews are often noted for their nostalgia. I propose that nostalgia for Vienna amongst refugees was not only a matter of thinking about the past, it was also future-oriented. It helped refugees to carve out a place for themselves and for Viennese culture in the United States, and it also provided a space to make claims on Viennese culture after their forced removal. Second, the linguistic strategies that refugees used at the Cabaret to navigate this process of assimilation and exile adapted discussions about assimilation that had been ongoing in spaces of popular entertainment since the turn of the century. In other words, in a context of radical rupture, refugees drew on old frameworks and strategies to understand their position and to present themselves to a diverse, often non-Jewish audience. And finally, the efforts that Viennese Jews made to reimagine Viennese culture in exile reverberated after 1945, both in the way that people thought about the city abroad and also in the cultural work of Jewish remigrants, the Jews who returned to Vienna after 1945. Now, nostalgic performances of Vienna emerged as the dominant aesthetic language on cabaret stages across the German-speaking emigration, from Shanghai to Caracas to Tel Aviv, although today I will focus only on New York, where performances had the furthest reaching impact due to the density of the German-speaking population and urban entertainments more broadly in the city. The Austrian refugees of the late 1930s encountered well-established German-speaking Jewish communities in New York, something that we've had the chance to hear a bit more about today as well. And cabaret performances at Vienna-style cafes and nightclubs quickly became part of the social glue of the refugee universe, concentrated in Washington Heights and on the Upper West Side. Now, cabaret had long been an important space for Viennese Jews. In Vienna before the Nazi period, Jews were overrepresented as artists at the cabaret. And the cabaret was a space where Jewish identities were performed, reaffirmed, and also transgressed, all through a satirical brand of humor that defined this entertainment at the cabaret. In exile, the cabaret remained an important Jewish space, but it also transformed as refugees translated the cultural form to their host countries. In exile, the emphasis shifted from satire to nostalgia. And to be sure, satirical humor, and especially Jewish humor, was still dominant at these exile cabarets. And similarly, nostalgia for the Habsburg monarchy had been present already starting after the collapse of the empire in 1918. However, the context of exile led to the further elaboration of nostalgia as the aesthetic language of the cabaret, and satirical humor was often directed towards supporting such efforts. Now, a key contention of this paper, then, is that the growing nostalgia was not apolitical. Nostalgia at the cabaret was not only about recalling a lost past, it was also always about power and property. For many Jews, particularly Austrian Jews, property, along with language and culture, was an important and tangible sign of Jewish acculturation into Austrian society. And from this perspective, the resurgence of nostalgia at the cabaret was related to an effort to make claims on Viennese culture in exile and to present Vienna within a framework of Jewish history and experience, all in a space that had so often been used to work through shifting questions of Jewish identity and belonging. In Exile, cabaret artists also built on ongoing debates about assimilation through their performances. During the interwar period, cabaret artists of Jewish heritage had participated in increasingly critical debates about assimilation, and they used language to carry out their critiques, moving between Yiddish, the language of pre-acculturated German Jewry, or also Eastern European Jews, and High German, the language of assimilation. This continued in Exile. For example, on his New York stage, the cabaret artist Hermann Leopoldi reproduced these linguistic patterns, but also adapted them to the American context, where asserting or performing an ethnic identity could serve as a part of an assimilation process. Leopoldi's performances moved between English, German, and Yiddish. One hit poked fun at the process of assimilation in the United States. On his path to fluency in English, the singer learns that a dog is a Hund, a hot dog is a Würstel, and finally that a refugee heißt Nebek, or a refugee is a sorry sack. Through the use of a mixture of High German, his Viennese accent, and Yiddish words, Leopoldi extended and adapted the discourse of acculturation in the context of the multi-ethnic empire to New York. And in this new context, English served as the language of assimilation, and German and Yiddish became the languages of pre-Americanized European Jewry. Meanwhile, the use of Yiddish words identified the experience of the refugee as a decidedly Jewish one, and pointed to the Jewishness of their refugee milieu. And this was particularly important in a context where many Jewish refugees hoped to distinguish themselves from Germans who were now enemies at war. Through cabaret performances, artists like Leopoldi saw their status in the United States rise. One journalist even suggested that their cabaret performances provided an alternative to the gloom that usually surrounded the refugee problem, and to the drably, and I'm quoting, the drably defeated parade of exiles coming to the country. In other words, these cabaret artists sometimes became representative refugees. In a radio appearance, one announcer credited Hermann Leopoldi with reincarnating old Vienna, the Vienna, and I'm quoting him, of gaiety and laughter through his performances. Cabaret performers merged Central European, Jewish, émigré, and Jewish identities within the framework of a Viennese nostalgia. Leopoldi's most successful song of this period, Die Novaks aus Prague, the Novaks from Prague, describes the refugee experience of German-speaking Jews from Prague. Written in 1941, the song chronicles the lives of the Novak family members as they travel through the 20th century. Before 1938, the family dreamed of far and fancy places to roam, but with the goose-step of time, their dreams turned into a nightmare, and the Novaks found themselves dispersed around the globe and dreaming of Prague. As the song explains, now Leo is sitting in Montevideo. He no longer thinks of senoras, for he now has quite different Zoras. And dear Aunt Annie, she sits in Havana. The Novaks are dreaming in strange places, scheming of only one place, they're dreaming of Prague. Though the members of this family found themselves dispersed throughout the globe, their nostalgia for Prague united them across time and space. Now, though Leopoldi's most popular song expressed a nostalgia for Prague rather than Vienna, his performances recalled a broader Central European world. Leopoldi's New York repertoire included numbers that he had developed in the context of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where linguistic diversity had characterized his pre-war and interwar performances. In the context of the multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire, those songs conjured an image of equality in what Leopoldi referred to as an amusing language nation. In New York, the performances transformed the interplay between dialect, language, and ethnicity into an image of a shared Central European heritage that was related to the Jewish experience of exile. Viennese nightclubs in New York became containers for a world of Jewish popular entertainment that reached beyond Vienna. Performances were not limited to Viennese artists, but also included artists from Berlin, Prague, and the Yiddish theater world. Vienna then became the aesthetic packaging for a Central European Jewish identity in exile. Though Viennese émigrés performed for Jewish and non-Jewish audiences alike, they also fit into a broader range of Jewish popular entertainments in New York. But at the same time, they universalized and popularized Vienna in the United States. Of Hermann Leopoldi's performance in 1942 in Detroit, for example, one critic noted that even those who had little knowledge of the language could find huge enjoyment in his songs, for he has the ability to speak universally. Indeed, it was not only the specific content of the performances that American audiences were absorbing, but rather a generalized Central European nostalgia. So in exile, Viennese popular performers succeeded in transforming Vienna into an aesthetic brand. And that aesthetic brand was associated with the Jewish experience of exile on the one hand and with Europe on the other. Jewish cabaret artists severed Vienna from its connections to Germany, National Socialism, and even sometimes to Austria. And at the heart of their nostalgic representations was an interpretation of Vienna as a Jewish multi-ethnic or émigré space. Popular performers promoted a Viennese nostalgia that understood the city as a shorthand for a fantasy of the cosmopolitan, peaceful, and cultured Europe that was being destroyed by National Socialism. And the cultural work of refugees and émigrés produced a fantasy of Vienna without the anti-Semites, the National Socialists, and even without Gentiles altogether. And that is a fantasy that has continued to inform representations of the city in the post-war period. Now, just by way of conclusion, I would like to say a few quick words about the small but significant group of cabaret artists who returned to Vienna after 1945, including both Farkas and Leopoldi. As they had in exile, the re-migrants made claims on the cabaret's cultural history, and they used their post-war speeches, writings, and performances to present themselves as inheritors of a Viennese cultural tradition. This time, however, they performed such songs and skits in a context of fierce anti-Semitism for audiences who were primarily not Jewish and who had little desire to accept the tight relationship between Vienna and Jewish history that the émigrés had established in exile. The long-term cultural work of Viennese Jewish émigrés reveals how the exile experience informed representations of Vienna during and after World War II. Jewish artists drew on their experiences in exile to help them to navigate their return to Austria. And the long-term cultural work of the cabaret artists reveals the post-war cabaret as one of the most sustained efforts to rebuild the type of Jewish and non-Jewish conjunction that had existed before the Angelus. However, the post-return repertoires of the cabaret artists attempted to revive this conjunction, at least implicitly, by bringing cultural materials and experiences from exile to post-war Vienna. But the story of these repertoires, the story of their remigration, also lays bare the limitations of such a project in a context where Jews were imagined as outsiders or absent, though they were present in small numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Our next speaker is Brigitte from Vienna. Bit of Brigitte's background. She served from 2004 to 2014 as the academic director of the Documentation Center that we've heard a lot about today in Vienna, where she also worked as a research fellow from 1979 to 2004. Beiler was a lecturer at the University of Vienna Institute for Contemporary History from 1998 to 2003, and she served as vice chair of the Austrian Historical Commission for investigation of and reporting on the whole complex of expropriation in Austria during the Nazi era and on restitution, compensation after 1945 by the Republic of Austria. Beiler's research focuses on resistance and persecution in Austria from 1938 to 1945, restitution and indemnification for victims of National Socialism, and right-wing extremism in Austria with an emphasis on Holocaust denial. Also on the reintegration of the Nazi Party members after 1945. Brigitte.
So, oh yeah. How do I go to my presentation? Is there a mouse or something?
Where did it go?
Fernsteuerung?
Oh yeah, this thing, I guess. I don't know. Ah,
No.
It's not yours? Betsy?
Ah, that's it. Okay. Great. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor for me to speak here in front of that audience. And I think that's a good end to all the presentations we have heard today. I want to say a few words, it's not much time which is allocated to us, just a few words how Austria dealt with that responsibility, how Austria approached restitution, indemnification claims, especially of her former Jewish citizens after the war. There were central factors which influenced that approach. First of all, political factors. The Declaration of Moscow was already mentioned today by Minister Eisingerich. That declaration, it had important influence on Austria's own image of her National Socialist past and the image of her role in that National Socialist past. As we heard today, the Allied forces declared in end of October 1943 in Moscow that Austria had been the first victim of National Socialist aggression and therefore should be restored as an independent state after the war. Austria, in the following years, deliberately neglected the second part of the declaration, which saw Austria as co-responsible for taking part in the war on the side of the German Reich, and stated that the Allied dealings with Austria would depend on her own contribution to her liberation. This last sentence was meant as a support for the Austrian resistance, but Austria herself later on used that part as reason to prefer political persecuted persons against Jewish victims of National Socialist persecution. Austria fundamentally saw responsibility for Nazi crimes and thus any obligation to compensation for it as lying with the German Reich and later on its successor state, the Federal Republic of Germany. Post-war leading politicians made every effort to underline Austria's status as a victim. They were afraid that Austria held co-responsible might be forced to pay reparations or would get less favorable conditions in the hoped-for state treaty. The peace treaties with the former satellite states of the Third Reich showed the way the Allied forces saw in front of the suffering of the victims of National Socialism. These peace treaties had articles forcing the states to return looted or confiscated property as well as to pay compensation. The first drafts of the Austrian State Treaty from January 1946 had similar passages and thus made it clear where the Allied priorities in respect of the dealing with victims of National Socialism lay. Therefore, in the following years, until the agreement on the State Treaty in 1955, these drafts for the State Treaty played an important role in all discussions on measures for the victims and supported the necessities to implant those measures. That means the State Treaty was used, especially by the Western Allies and thereby the United States, as a means of pressure to push Austria to do something, to put it blankly, for the victims of National Socialism. But the interests of the political parties, at that time mainly Social Democrats and Conservatives in government, lay on gaining the maximum of votes like in any other representative democratic system. In the special post-war situation and the years after that, that meant winning over the votes of former National Socialists, respectively their family members, friends and sympathizers, at a whole about 1 million votes. That's in a country which had not at all 7 million inhabitants, a lot of votes. Victims of National Socialism living in Austria, on the other hand, were far less, around 7,000 to 10,000 Jews and some thousand people persecuted for political, national or other reasons, and former Austrians were not present at all. Their votes, the votes of the victims, were not able to decide any elections. And besides, there still existed anti-Semitism not only in the Austrian population, but partly as well in the ranks of the politicians and with important bureaucrats who were responsible to implant measures for victims of National Socialism. Prejudice about the so-called emigrants, I'm going with Bert Brecht, who said we were evicted, we were not immigrants. It's a very a good poem by him. And in conspiracy thinking, especially when the US allied occupation force put pressure on Austria for her dealing with the victims of National Socialism, then there surfaced a conspiracy theories. That's the immigrants. They are pushing and they have so much influence in the United States and therefore they are so bad to us. And these were prejudices that having been implanted by National Socialist propaganda already and were still alive in parts of the Austrian population. And additionally, sad to say, victims' competition made things worse. Formerly politically persecuted Austrians saw these emigrants as traitors to the Austrian cause, while they, the resistance fighters and politically persecuted, had fought and suffered for Austria. The mostly Jewish refugees, in their opinion, had sat comfortably in their club chairs, as the Federal Chancellor Leopold Fiegel once put it. There are already 45 first measures for former victims had to be decided upon, and already in July 1945, the then provisional government, the first general elections took place in November 1945. that provisional government passed the first Victims' Welfare Act. That act should grant support for the re-establishing of an economical existence and, if necessary, pensions to those former resistance fighters not being able to earn their own living because of the consequences of the persecution. Persons having only been persecuted because of race, religion, or nationality stayed excluded from the benefits of that act. That I meant with the second part of the Moscow Declaration, the preferring of victims of political persecution. That changed in 1947 when the now democratically elected parliament passed the new Victims' Welfare Act. That now included victims of persecution as well, but as a second less worthy category of possible claimants. The important benefits of the Act, especially the possible payment of pensions, still were reserved for formerly active fighters against National Socialism. From 1949 onwards, former persecuted people having been especially heavily inflicted by the persecution could get pension payments as well, but they had to be more inflicted than those who were persecuted because of political reasons. That changed over the years, but in fact, the two, in their possible claims, quite different categories of victims are to be found in the Act until present days. But the central disadvantage of the Act was its reservation for Austrian citizens only. And that meant applicants had not only to have had the citizenship before 1938, but at the time of the application as well. Therefore, most of the approximately 100,000 former Austrians having fled abroad and survived, and they had in many cases accepted the citizenship of their new home country, they could not get any payment or support by the Victims' Welfare Act. The only exception was 1953, when pressure of the Western occupational forces motivated the Austrian government to grant compensation payment for times of incarceration in jails or concentration camps for former Austrians as well, these having been granted to victims with Austrian citizenship already the year before. And that raised discussions, victims' competition, why foreigners should get paid that money from the Austrian state. That, 1953, was the first, and until 1962, the last time former Austrians could get advantages because of the Victims' Welfare Act. As a result of the negotiations with the Committee for Jewish Claims on Austria, 1953 to 1956, the Austrian government founded a fund giving support to former Austrians depending on the amount of their inflictment in form of lump payments. It was a so-called Hilfsfonds aid fund. But that was a very small gesture compared to the benefits of people still being Austrians. Later on, due to payments of the Federal Republic of Germany in the settlement of Bad Kreuznach, far-reaching amendments of the Victims' Welfare Act came into place. For instance, compensation payments for times of internment, for times having lived underground, but only if it was under inhuman conditions, lump sum payment for having to wear the yellow star, the Judenstern, and these could be applied by former Austrian citizens as well, that I meant before with 1962. And then there remained the question of the looted property. Between 1947, 2 years after the war, and 1949, the Austrian parliament passed 7 restitution acts, each one applying on special cases of expropriated property. All restitution acts restricted the restitution to property still existing and traceable. In other words, only restitution in kind was possible. There was no compensation for all the property having been looted and later on destroyed one way or the other. For instance, 2/3 of the Aryanized Jewish businesses were liquidated. They didn't exist anymore. Or the first and only compensation for these businesses was possible after the Agreement of Washington of 2001, and then people could get very small lump sum, also payments for their lost property. You can think about how many of them lived so long. But due to restricted financial means, applicants only could get a small part of the lost amount of money. The first Restitution Act of July 1946, sorry, it was 1946, a mistake before, covered property which had been expropriated by an act of authority and was now in the hands of the state. The second Restitution Act, February 1947, standardized the restitution of property which had fallen to the Republic as a result of the Nazi prohibition or war crimes law. On the same day, Parliament passed the Third Restitution Act, which was the key one for the victims of Nazism and also the most politically controversial one, because it was the legal basis for reclaiming looted property now being in the hands of private persons or corporations. Therefore, it reached into the sphere of the individual owner of looted property. Even the drafts to that Third Restitution Act were challenged by business interest groups. Their main argument was that restitution introduced uncertainty into the economy and should therefore be limited as far as possible. Because of the claims of former Austrians, they argued that now Austrian property would fall into the hands of foreigners, would leave the countries, and thus an old anti-Semitic stereotype surfaced: the greedy Jew without true patriotic feelings. We find that argument in many discussions and publications, newspaper articles in that time. It was the Western allies, in particularly the United States, who continued to push for the restitution of expropriated property. Austria and some Austrian politicians tried to put an end to that Restitution Act. As a friend of mine put it in a film title, "Let's keep it." It was, if you read the things, you get the impression they hoped if the time for application would end, then the present owner could keep the looted property. But as I said, the Western allies said no, that's not possible. On one hand, there were 4 further restitution acts which weren't as important as the first 3 were passed. They concerned a broad range of issues, from the restitution of expropriated trademarks and patents to company names which had been changed or deleted. On the other end, the Allied forced the Austrian government and the Austrian National Council as a lawmaker to continue the time of possible claims according to the Restitution Acts until 1954. And at the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, the rulings of the restitution commissions, which decided on claims according to the Third Restitution Act, these rulings tended to interpret the legal provisions in favor of the applicant for restitution until about 48, 49, but then as an increasingly restrictive attitude towards the victims of Nazism is evident, like my colleagues in the Historical Commission found out. That went sort of parallel with the political climate, tending more and more to the reintegration of former National Socialists on one hand, and was connected to the efforts of the parliamentary parties for amendments of the Third Restitution Law in favor of the Aryanizers. All these efforts were prohibited by the Western Allies, especially again the United States, in hinting on the drafts of the State Treaty. The restriction on identifiable still existing property gave immobile property a strong advantage in restitution claims. Real estate, therefore, was the central category of restituted property. It was easy to trace. The least chance of restitution was for mobile property, as long as it did not belong to any famous collection of art or library. And no Restitution Act was passed for expropriated tenancy and leasehold rights, copyrights and licenses. Tenancy and leasehold rights were of importance because before 1938, there was almost no property of apartments in Austria. Most apartments, especially in Vienna, were leased or rented. And it was approximately more than 50,000 apartments were Aryanized, but the former owners, the former leasehold holders were not able to reclaim their apartments when returning, for instance, from a concentration camps. Only with the Amendment Act to the National Fund in 2001, a lump sum payment made in settlement of tenancy and leasehold rights, but it was a very small payment. Article 26, finally signed of the State Treaty, finally signed in 1955, contains the Austrian obligation to restitution of all traceable and confiscated property. Property not claimed was to be collected and used in favor of victims of National Socialism. The Austrian government did not pay much attention to that article, thinking its obligations were fulfilled by the 7 Restitution Acts. The Western signatory states, again led by the United States, did not share the Austrian point of view, but demanded compensation for property categories which were not dealt with by the Restitution Acts. There, the Americans partly made use of the catalogue of not fulfilled demands of the Committee for Jewish Claims on Austria, which were presented during its negotiations with Austria. The negotiations on Article 26 of the State Treaty took 3 years and ended in an exchange of notes in 1959. According to that, Austria introduced into its legal system 1958 a legal settlement for compensation for claims arising from life insurance policies. These policies had been expropriated from the policyholders in a manner which involved the insurer having to pay the German Reich. Only a few people registered claims according to that Act of 58, and the compensation was only partial. 1959, the Austrian side promised to establish a settlement fund, Abgeltungsfonds, which envisaged compensation for expropriated assets in bank accounts, securities, cash, mortgage claims, and for the means that were used to meet Nazi discriminatory taxes, Vermögensabgabe and were 2 taxes, they amounted to 50%. It took 2 more years until the Settlement Fund Act passed Parliament. The law provided no norms for the actual criteria of compensation payments, and there was no legal right to compensation. Maximum payments were envisaged, and the total amount of $6 million was not sufficient to cover all claimed damages. And furthermore, Austria conceded to establish collection points for not claimed or heirless looted property. That collection points had to affect the restitution claim, realizing the value of the property and ultimately distributed the proceeds to victims of Nazism in Austria. And these measures from the beginning of the 1960s put a first end of the development of compensation in Austria. It took more than 2 decades. It started with with the discussion debate of the war history of Kurt Waldheim, led to the memorial year of 1988, 50 years after the Angelus, and all that historical work which was done then. We today heard the name of Hans Safran. He was one of those who made clear Austria, the co-responsibility of many Austrians for the crimes of the National Socialists, led to new discussions. 1991, Federal Chancellor Vranitzky stated that many Austrians had taken part in the National Socialist crimes, for the first time confessing to an Austrian co-responsibility, not of Austria, but of the Austrians. And further discussions led to the establishment of the National Fund 1995, which tried to compensate possibly all groups of victims of National Socialism, because many groups like the so-called asoziale, persecuted people, and others were at that time not included in the Victims' Welfare Act. And later on, the international discussions of the end of the 1990s led to not only to the establishment of our Historical Commission, but finally to the Agreement of Washington in 2001, which tried to put an end, but in the end, the sum allotted to that fund was not enough, was not sufficient to cover all claims, and it again led to some discontentment, understandable discontentment of the claimants. So to sum up, it's not true that Austria has done nothing. That's not true. Austria has done a lot, but it was step by step by step. It was a large amount of laws, of acts, of amendments. I just gave a few. There are many, many more. I could tell which were not. I just told you about the most important. And to sum it up, if you imagine you are a former Austrian living in the Midwest of the United States, in Australia, in South Africa, New Zealand, Bolivia, you name it, you didn't know at what time you could apply for what damage. You could not know when the law wasn't in force anymore. There was no internet, there was no email, telephone was complicated. So that made it really, really difficult for all these people to get to their rights, to get compensation. They would have used and they would have needed for a re-establishment, many of them would have needed it for a re-establishment of their economical life. So it's a difficult chapter of Austrian post-war history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brigitte. I'm afraid our time has run out, so if there are specific questions you want to ask, please try to catch the speakers in the break. We now have a 15-minute break. We convene again at 5:15. Thank you.